Welcome back to Get Down to Business, the show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. I've got a real treat in store for you. I've got Milan Kordestani, an expert on Gen Next. And I was just talking about this, I think, last week on the program. Millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, these are all the terms. But our man over here is the expert on the topic. He's an entrepreneur, writer, and founder of several companies who is redefining the meaning of success in business with a focus on building sustainable businesses that drive positive social change at scale. Milan is a three-time founder who wants to encourage solutions beyond his companies through storytelling and narration of civil discourse. Milan, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. You just wrote a new book, I'm Just Saying, which really compiles a lot of the things that you've been seeing and just saying. So I'm curious, Milan, I've written a book. It's hard work. What inspired you to write a book about maintaining civil discourse in today's world? Lord knows we need it. And what message do you hope readers take away from it?
Sure. So, I wrote the book because I wanted to address division that exists at all levels, I think, in our country right now, but to an extent around the world. There seems to be this intolerance and inability to communicate with people who are the other, especially since we became a predominantly digital communicating society. That digital communication is really devoid of nuance, and so we end up not having a lot of the we end up not prioritizing how we communicate and the effectiveness of our communication as much as we once did, because it doesn't affect us the same way, right? When we're in person, we feel something a bit more, and it's a bit different than, you can have keyboard courage and say whatever you want online and walk away feeling, like nothing ever happened.
Yeah, that's for sure. Again, I'm chatting with Milan Kordestani, who is the author of I'm Just Saying, a guide to maintaining civil discourse in an increasingly divided world. So let's talk about civil discourse. I mean, the reality is especially as we're coming to a presidential election season, there's a lot of folks out there that have different views. So why do you think it's important for people to engage in civil discourse? And I'm really curious, especially as you talk about millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, in what is the method of civil discourse these days?
Sure. So, especially addressing what you were saying about coming up on an election, I think that the reality is a lot of these politicians are really divisive, and they have been a lot recently. They haven't always been, but they drive division because it's easier to, collect a group and get them to believe and vote for you and all of this. But the reality is whenever there is such division, the real loser is 50% of the American population. Because I really do believe that the majority of us are able to come to some form of common ground if we begin communicating a bit better. And that's the crux of civil discourse, this idea that the majority of communication should be prioritized or have the focus of reaching common ground. And, that can exist at all levels, but civil discourse is supposed to be something that can, exist in your marriage, in your relationships with your family, and then, of course, with those that you're just meeting for the first time. And I think across the generational divide, we see different generations have different interests in the way that they communicate outwardly. We see that, for example, Gen Z has been very, digital. Millennials are, they have been the early group that was creating YouTube channels and content. Gen Z was predominantly on social media. And then they're saying Gen Alpha, which is, underneath Gen Z, I think that's 2008 and younger, is going to be a generation that actually is going to detract from the desire to be on social media so much. And they might even, this anecdotally, they say it'll be cringy for them, seeing that their parents have been trying to exploit them and create vlogs of their family lives and idealize their lives on camera for social media and trying to make money off of that. So, it's quite interesting, the types of conversations that are, going to need to happen across these generational divides.
This is wild, and you're giving us a good insight into. I honestly did not even know it was called Gen Alpha, but I guess that makes sense. We're going back to the very beginning, which maybe is just a metaphor for what they're actually doing, going back to the basics. But it's interesting, those folks, 2008 and younger, and especially some of the folks, sort of coming of age in the past few years of the pandemic, and in an era where a lot of in-person engagement was not possible. There's some social norms. I'll just go so blunt and say that are non-existent. Are you seeing any trends in your research, Milan, in terms of worrying signs or maybe positive signs from folks that may have been ordinarily in social settings, but they were pulled away from it.
Yes, there's a lot of great research on the decline in a lot of the community and like civic engagements that we once had. People attend church a lot less. People are in less bowling groups than they once used to be. That's just like a fun example. But sports teams and poker clubs and all of this, like they are much less than they once were. That's one trend that's quite interesting. But the other is even like expressing opinions. We seem to be seeing people fearful of expressing opinions because of the era we live in now, where there's heightened cancellation or fear of retribution, or this belief of intolerance, that people are not as tolerant as they could be, and they can't see the humanity, or that any information you put out on the internet is quite permanent. That creates a fear among younger generations, especially, and that fear then makes it really difficult to connect with people, and that then further increases division. And so with the older generations, they're a bit less of like when millennials and up. I mean, millennials are definitely part of the group that walks around airports still with, headphones entirely and through life with, headphones in the ears. But among the older generations, we see that it's a generation that doesn't do that. And actually, when they're out in the world, they're trying to connect with people, and they have these micro conversations. And those micro conversations are super important for, kind of inspiring your hope and in fellow citizens of your country.
Absolutely. Again, chatting with Milan Kordestani, an expert on Gen Next, meaning millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. And Milan, we are a very practical show over here. So going back to our early conversation about differing viewpoints, what homework assignments do you have? How can we effectively communicate with those who hold differing viewpoints, especially as we're getting into the summer season? People are going to be with family and so on, without resorting to insults or personal attacks.
So I think the best piece of advice that I can give is to be really curious instead of getting angry. When someone says something that makes you normally angry or upset, or wants to prove your point and prove that they're wrong, and get into that, instead ask so many questions, because you're curious and want to understand their perspective. How did they arrive at this opinion that you so egregiously disagree with? And as they're asking those questions, if you find yourself, you want to find it yourself being more open-minded and actually listening to what they're saying. But that active listening and asking of the questions, I really believe then will allow you to respond better and think about, how can I create common ground? It gives you time to then not get angry and defensive, and to, show up better to that conversation. Be solution-oriented.
Absolutely, Milan. We've got about a minute and a half remaining, and you just mentioned a key buzzword: active listening. We know, especially in the business community, that active listening does foster more constructive conversations. Again, using that term homework assignment, can you give our listeners something practical that they can do to sort of promote active listening that will allow for better conversations, both in civil discourse, but frankly in business too?
Sure. So when you have a very clear intention of why you're in a conversation, then it becomes a lot easier to active listen, because you're listening for some form of information, right? Or you're trying to understand something to be able to either create that common ground, or create a contract with them, or get a deal, a new partnership, whatever it might be. And so that's why it's super important, whether it's in business or elsewhere, to be a great active listener, because it allows you to understand someone better and connect with them better, which ultimately, compounds everything great in your life.
Well, you've shared a lot of great tips and advice, and I know you have a great new book called I'm Just Saying. We've been chatting with Milan Kordestani. Milan, I know everybody will want to pick up a copy of the book and get in touch with you. How can we do that?
You can find me on all social media at Milan Kordestani, or at milankordestani.com. And the book is available everywhere right now.
Fantastic, Milan. It's a great read. Appreciate you promoting positive conversations. We'll bring you back on to talk about how that Gen Alpha is shaping up, because that's our future workforce over here. And I know that's something that all of our listeners care deeply about. Milan, again, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course, would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Again, we are the show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. Great conversation so far, but don't touch that dial, because we've got a lot more in store for you. But in fact, we have 10 plus years of archives of this fantastic show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. You get on my website, shalomklein.com, shalomklein.com, or get on your favorite podcast app. Just search for Get Down to Business, and you can find it at Google, Apple, Spotify, wherever podcasts can be found. But be sure you rate, review, and share. It makes it even easier for others to find the program. We have hundreds of past guests. And speaking of feedback, I always love to hear your feedback on who you would want to hear from and what kinds of topics you want us to talk about. You could get in touch again on my website, shalomklein.com. Just click that contact button. Looking forward to hearing from you. Again, headlines, commercials. We'll be right back after this quick break.